My entire future hinged on the state debate championship until a hateful slur from the audience tried to silence me forever. What came next wasn't just about winning. It was a moral reckoning that changed the rules of the game. The air in the auditorium tasted like old paper and cheap floor wax. It was the smell of 100 years of hopes and failures, all absorbed into the dusty red velvet of the seats. For me, an 18-year-old kid from the side of town, most people in this room only drove through with their doors locked, it was supposed to be the smell of victory. This was it, the state debate championship, the final round. My partner Steve and I had clawed our way here through 3 years of early mornings, late nights, and sacrificing every weekend for research and practice. On the line wasn't just a ridiculously oversized trophy, but a full-ride scholarship to the state university. For Steve, whose parents were both professors, it was a matter of pride. For me, it was the only key I had to a door that had always been locked. Steve was my rock. Where I was all frantic energy and passionate, sometimes messy, arguments, he was a pillar of calm, methodical logic. He saw angles I missed, anticipated counter-arguments before they were even formed, and could dismantle an opponent's entire case with a single, perfectly timed question. We were a unit. Before every round, we had a ritual. He'd hold up a fist, I'd bump it, and he'd say, "You be the fire, I'll be the focus." And I'd reply, "Let's burn 'em down." It was cheesy, but it was ours. Today was no different. We did our bump, shared that look of grim determination, and walked onto the stage. The topic was resolved. Standardized testing is an inequitable barrier to higher education. It was a subject I knew in my bones. I lived it. Our opponents were from a wealthy prep school, two polished kids in tailored suits who argued with the sterile confidence of those who have never had to worry about anything in their lives. The debate was fierce. We traded blows, parried arguments, and navigated the complex dance of rebuttals and cross-examinations. We were good. No, we were great. We were in perfect sync, anticipating each other's needs, setting each other up for killer points. I could feel the momentum shifting our way. The judges were nodding. The quiet hum of the audience was turning into murmurs of approval. It was my turn for the final 2-minute summary. This was my moment. I stepped forward, my notes a blur. I didn't need them. I spoke about the kid who has to work a job after school instead of getting a tutor. I spoke about the inherent cultural biases baked into the questions. I spoke about potential being a fire that can be smothered by a system that only knows how to measure the quality of the kindling. I was flying. The words poured out of me, a torrent of everything I'd felt and seen my entire life. My voice was clear, ringing with a conviction that felt more real than anything I'd ever said. And that's when it happened. From somewhere in the middle of the audience, a man's voice, thick with cheap beer and cheaper malice, cut through the silence. It wasn't just a heckle. It was a slur. A single, ugly, racist word aimed directly at me, designed to curdle everything I was saying, to reduce me from a debater, from a student, from a person, into a stereotype. My blood ran cold. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. The words, my beautiful, soaring words, died on my tongue, turning to ash in my mouth. Time seemed to warp. The entire auditorium, which had been a sea of indistinct faces, snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. I saw the judges' pens freeze over their notepads. I saw our opponents' smug faces morph into masks of shocked discomfort. I saw the moderator, a flustered history teacher named Mr. Gable, open and close his mouth like a fish. The room, which had been filled with my voice, was now engulfed in a deafening, crushing silence. My mind was just static. White noise where my rebuttal should have been. I was standing on the biggest stage of my life, with the most important opportunity I would ever get, and I had been shattered by one man's hatred. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, a weight of pity and morbid curiosity. I wanted to shrink, to disappear, to run off the stage and never look back. My 2 minutes were ticking away. Seconds felt like hours. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, completely and utterly broken. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was Steve. He hadn't looked at me. His face was a blank canvas, completely unreadable. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up from his chair. He didn't pick up his notes. He didn't look at the judges. He just started walking. He walked right past me, past the lectern, to the very front of the stage. The moderator started to say something. "Mr. Jankowski, your partner still has time." But Steve held up a single steady hand, and the words died in Mr. Gable's throat. The entire room held its breath. Steve's eyes scanned the crowd, moving with unnerving calm, until they landed on a flushed, belligerent-looking man in a stained polo shirt. He'd found him. Steve's gaze locked onto the man, and a new kind of silence fell over the room. It wasn't shocked silence anymore. It was the heavy, charged silence that comes right before lightning strikes. My feet felt nailed to the floorboards. I was an observer in my own body, watching as Steve stood there, a quiet sentinel against a wave of simmering hostility. The man in the crowd, a beefy guy with a face like a clenched fist, seemed to shrink a little under Steve's unblinking stare. His belligerence curdled into a kind of confused defiance. He puffed out his chest, but his eyes darted around, suddenly aware that he was the focal point of every other person in the room. He had wanted to be a voice of anonymous hate. Steve had turned him into a spectacle. Then Steve spoke. His voice didn't carry the anger or the hurt that was churning in my own gut. It was calm, measured. It was his debate voice, but amplified by the stage microphone, it seemed to fill every corner of the vast auditorium, each word clear and sharp as shattered glass. He didn't speak to the man. He didn't even look at him anymore. He turned his head slightly, addressing the judge's table and the moderator. "Mr. Gable, honorable judges," the formal address was so jarring, so contrary to the raw ugliness of the moment, that it immediately commanded complete attention. "I must rise on a point of order." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. A point of order? In the middle of my final summary? It was unheard of. Mr. Gable, looking relieved to have a procedural script to follow, stammered, "A point of order for what, Mr. Jankowski?" Steve's eyes swept across the judges' faces, one by one. "The resolution on the floor," he said, his voice dropping a fraction, drawing everyone in, "is standardized testing is an inequitable barrier to higher education. Our opponents have argued, quite articulately, that the system, while perhaps imperfect, is ultimately a meritocracy. They contend that external factors, such as societal prejudice, do not fundamentally compromise the integrity of the evaluation process." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. I could see where he was going. My heart, which had been a leaden weight in my chest, began to beat again, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. He wasn't just defending me. He was turning this into a weapon. "A few moments ago," Steve continued, his voice devoid of any emotion, a surgeon stating a fact, "a member of the audience provided us all with a live, real-time demonstration of an inequitable, prejudicial barrier. He did not critique my partner's argument. He did not challenge his data. He attempted to invalidate his humanity. and by extension, his right to even make the argument. The silence in the room was now absolute. Even the shuffling of feet and the coughing had stopped. It was the silence of 1,000 people holding a collective breath. "This is no longer a theoretical debate, honorable judges," Steve stated, his gaze finally resting on the head judge, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Albright. The opposition's primary contention that such barriers are not a significant factor has been empirically and offensively disproven in this very room. The premise of the round has been fundamentally compromised. He took a small step back, a gesture of finality. Therefore, my partner and I cannot, in good conscience, continue this debate. To do so would be to tacitly agree that this is an acceptable part of the process, that a person should have to endure racism as a condition of academic competition. My jaw was on the floor. He was ending it. He was throwing away our chance, the scholarship, everything we had worked for, over this. But as I looked at his rigid back, I felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost brought me to my knees. It was more important than any trophy. "So, what are you saying, Mr. Jankowski?" Mrs. Albright asked, her voice tight. "Are you forfeiting the round?" Steve gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, ma'am," he said softly, but the microphone carried his words to every ear. "I am not forfeiting. I am concluding my partner's summary." He turned his head and, for the first time, looked directly at me. In his eyes, I didn't see pity. I saw a challenge. He was giving the stage back to me, but on new terms. Then he turned back to the judges. "Our final point is this. The barrier is real. It is here. It is in this room. The question is no longer whether you can acknowledge it in theory, but whether you will confront it in practice." He pointed a single, steady finger, not at the heckler, but at the rule book sitting on the judge's table. "The rules state that the judges have the power to disqualify participants for unsportsmanlike conduct. We contend that this extends to an audience that makes participation impossible. You have the power to remove the barrier." His voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. "Your ruling on that man is your ruling on the debate. Your decision right now will tell us, and everyone here, whether these barriers are, in fact, an inescapable part of the system." He stood there, a statue of defiance, having turned a debate about policy into a trial of the very people judging it. "We rest our case, and we await your verdict." The air in the auditorium became thick enough to breathe. Steve's words echoed in the profound silence, a gauntlet thrown down not just in front of the judges, but in front of everyone. He had reframed the entire event. The spotlight was no longer on me, the victim, or on the heckler, the villain. It was squarely on the three people sitting at the judge's table, their faces pale under the stage lights. They were no longer adjudicating a high school debate. They were presiding over a referendum on their own principles. Mrs. Albright, the head judge, looked as if she'd been slapped. She exchanged a wide-eyed, panicked glance with the other two judges, a portly man with a wilting bow tie and a younger woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The man in the crowd, the source of all this, now seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had done. He wasn't just a loudmouth anymore. He was Exhibit A in a case being argued for the state championship. He tried to sink into his seat, his face a mottled patchwork of crimson and purple. The people around him began to lean away, creating a small, isolated island of shame. Mr. Gable, the moderator, fumbled with his microphone, his voice a nervous squeak. Judges, this is highly irregular. The rules, Mr. Gable." Mrs. Albright cut him off, her voice sharp and authoritative, snapping everyone back to attention. "The rules are designed to ensure a fair and equitable competition. Mr. Jankowski has raised a legitimate point about the conditions of that competition." She picked up the slim rulebook, her fingers tracing the spine as if searching for a forgotten scripture. Our opponents, the two prep school kids, were frozen in a state of stunned disbelief. Their perfectly constructed arguments, their polished rebuttals, had been rendered completely irrelevant. They had been debating a hypothetical world of pure logic and evidence, and Steve had just dragged the messy, ugly real world onto the stage with them. One of them, a blond kid named Chad, started to raise his hand, as if to object, but his partner discreetly pulled it back down. They knew, better than anyone, that there was no counter-argument to this. My own paralysis had finally broken, replaced by a strange, buzzing energy. I watched Steve walk slowly back to our table and sit down. He didn't look at me, just straightened a stack of note cards that were already perfectly aligned. He was giving me the space, the silence, to find my footing again. He had built me a shield out of logic and procedure, and now he was waiting to see if I would pick up my sword. Mrs. Albright cleared her throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "While the formal rules do not explicitly cover audience conduct in this manner," she began, choosing her words with extreme care, "the spirit of the competition demands a level playing field, a field that has been undeniably tilted." She looked directly at the man in the polo shirt. Her voice lost its judicial temperance and gained a steel edge. "Sir," she called out, her voice amplified and accusatory. "Stand up." The man looked around wildly, as if hoping she meant someone else, but every eye in the room was on him. Slowly, reluctantly, he got to his feet. He was shorter than he sounded, and without the cover of the crowd, he just looked small and pathetic. "The language you used is unacceptable," Mrs. Albright declared. "It has no place here." "It has no place anywhere. You have disrupted this championship, and you have failed to show a basic level of decency to one of our finalists." She paused, letting the condemnation settle. "Security will escort you from the premises now." A smattering of applause broke out, quickly growing into a wave of relieved, supportive clapping. Two uniformed security guards who had been standing by the main doors started making their way down the aisle. The man, his face burning with humiliation, didn't even wait for them. He stumbled over his own feet, pushing his way past the knees of his neighbors, and practically ran up the aisle and out the door, a coward retreating from the consequences of his own hate. The doors swung shut behind him, and the applause died down. A sense of order felt restored, but the tension remained. The problem had been removed, but the damage was done. Mrs. Albright looked from the empty doorway back to Steve and me. "Mr. Jankowski, Mr. Henderson," she said, her tone softening slightly. "On behalf of the League, I apologize. That should never have happened." She took a deep breath. "Now we must decide how to proceed. Given the interruption, we can declare the round null and void, or we can allow Mr. Henderson to complete his summary." My heart hammered against my ribs. Here it was, an out. We could walk away, maybe share the championship, a compromise born out of chaos. It would be safe. No one would blame us. I looked at Steve. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The choice was mine. I thought about the scholarship, I thought about the years of work, and I thought about the look on that man's face before he'd spoken, the casual, confident cruelty. If I walked away, he still won. He had managed to silence me. Steve hadn't just shut him down. He had given me back my voice. It was up to me to use it. I walked back to the lectern. My hands were shaking, but I gripped the sides of it until my knuckles were white. I looked at the timer. I had 58 seconds left. I looked out at the audience, at the judges, at our opponents. I took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the dust and the wax and the newfound possibility. "Honorable judges," I began, my voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. "My partner is correct. The debate is no longer about whether barriers exist. The debate is now about what we do when we are forced to confront them." I pushed my prepared notes aside. They belonged to a different debate, a different world. You can't quantify the impact of what happened in a statistic. You can't cite it from a study. It's the moment a student's confidence shatters. It's the seed of doubt that whispers, "You don't belong here." It's a weight that students like me carry onto the field long before the competition even begins. I locked eyes with Mrs. Albright. Removing that man was not a solution. It was a temporary reprieve. The real solution is to arm students with the unwavering belief that their voices matter more than the hate meant to silence them. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of pure, righteous fire. My partner and I are not forfeiting, and we are not asking for a mulligan. We are finishing this round, and we are going to win it. I turned and looked directly at the two boys from the prep school, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. And with my remaining 30 seconds, I would like to cede the floor to our opponents. Let's see if they still believe those barriers aren't a factor. The challenge hung in the air, a live wire crackling in the stunned silence. Ceding my time to our opponents? It was a move so audacious, so completely outside the formal structure of debate, that for a moment nobody knew how to react. It was like throwing a chess piece at your opponent instead of moving it. I had just handed a loaded gun to the two people whose entire goal was to beat us. They could use the time to tear me apart, to call it a cheap emotional ploy, to re-establish their case on solid, if now deeply uncomfortable, ground. I saw the flash of calculation in Chad's eyes. This was his chance to be the hero of his own story, the cool-headed logician against the emotional outburst. He stood up, smoothing the front of his already immaculate blazer. His partner, a shorter, dark-haired kid named Ben, looked at him with an expression of pure horror, tugging at his sleeve, but Chad shook him off. He walked to his lectern, the very picture of composed confidence. The judges watched, their faces unreadable. Steve sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He had placed his trust in me, and now I had placed our entire future in the hands of a kid who probably saw me as little more than a stepping stone to his Ivy League application. Chad tapped the microphone, a little thump-thump that seemed to echo for miles. He cleared his throat. "Honorable judges," he began, his voice as smooth and polished as his shoes. "My opponents have certainly given us a lot to consider." He paused, and I braced myself for the attack. "They have argued that the debate is no longer about standardized testing, but about the very nature of the barriers that exist within our society." He looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside, mirroring my own gesture. When he looked up again, something in his expression had changed. The practiced confidence was gone, replaced by something more genuine, more uncertain. "For the past hour," he said, speaking more to the room than to the judges, "my partner and I have been arguing a theoretical point. We've been using statistics and studies to argue that the system, while flawed, is fundamentally fair. We talked about merit. We talked about equal opportunity." He took a breath, and his gaze drifted over to me. For the first time, he wasn't looking at me as an opponent, but as a person. "We were wrong," he said, the two words dropping into the auditorium with the force of a physical weight. A gasp rippled through the audience. Ben, his partner, sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. But it wasn't a gesture of shame. It looked like relief. "It's easy to talk about meritocracy from a position of privilege," Chad continued, his voice gaining a new kind of strength, one that came from honesty, not rehearsal. "It's easy to dismiss anecdotal evidence when your own anecdotes are all of success. We built our case in a sterile environment, a vacuum where the kind of hatred we all just witnessed doesn't exist. But it does exist. And to ignore it, to pretend it doesn't fundamentally alter the equation, it's an academic lie." He looked at the judges, his eyes pleading. "My partner and I can no longer in good conscience defend our position. To do so would be to argue that what happened to Mr. Henderson was just an anomaly, an irrelevant data point. It wasn't. It was the whole point. He's right. The barrier is real." He took a step back from the lectern. "We concede the round, and we congratulate our opponents on not just a victory in debate, but a victory for decency." He walked back to his table and sat down, refusing to look at anyone, his face flushed. The auditorium erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a standing ovation, a roar of approval that shook the very foundations of the old building. People were cheering, whistling, some were even crying. I looked at Steve, and he finally broke his stoic composure. A slow, wide grin spread across his face, and he gave me a thumbs up. Mrs. Albright was banging her gavel, but she was smiling too. "Order! Order!" she called, her voice full of emotion. Once the room had settled back into a low buzz, she looked at the four of us on the stage. "In 20 years of judging, I have never seen anything like this," she said, her voice thick. "I have never seen a round decided not by rhetoric or evidence, but by character." She looked from Chad and Ben to Steve and me. "This panel is in unanimous agreement. The win and the state championship goes to Mr. Jankowski and Mr. Henderson." The roar from the crowd was even louder this time. Steve and I met in the middle of the stage, and for the first time ever, we didn't bump fists. We hugged, a full, back-thumping, desperate hug, surrounded by the sound of a world that, for a moment, felt a little more just. As we were packing up our things, a ridiculously oversized trophy now sitting between our briefcases, Chad and Ben approached us. Chad stuck out his hand. "I meant what I said," he said, his voice quiet. "You guys earned this, and I'm sorry for everything." I shook his hand. "It took guts to do what you did," I told him. "Thank you." Steve shook his hand as well. "That was the best rebuttal I've ever seen," he said with a wry smile. Walking out of the auditorium, the air outside felt clean and new. The scholarship was real. My future was real. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a door that had been kicked open. But the victory felt bigger than that. It wasn't just my win. It was Steve's, for his unwavering loyalty. It was Chad's, for his unexpected integrity. It was a win for every kid who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Steve slung an arm over my shoulder as we walked toward the parking lot. "So," he said, grinning, "I was the focus. You were the fire." He paused, looking at the setting sun. "But I think today we were both the fire." I looked at him, my best friend, my partner. "Yeah," I said, a smile finally reaching my own face. "We burned 'em down." And in the smoldering ashes of that ugly moment, we had found something bright and hopeful and true. We hadn't just won a debate. We had changed the terms of it, And for the first time, I truly believed that my voice was something that could never be silenced again.